Mr. Prasad, welcome to the scenario. Uh,
Thank you.
and thanks for staying there for a couple of minutes more. But it has been just a beautiful day, and you will
Oh,
see.
I'm sorry I missed most of it, but David's words were golden, so I'll have to catch up with all of you later. And David,
You
thank
made
you.
it. You are here, and now means I know we have people here, and we literally means I know Tim and David are still on the line, but
Hi, Tim. I'm
I'm
sorry I
just
missed
looking forward to
the
just having a conversation
presentation.
with you. Means trying to connect to what David was
Yeah,
saying. Means I think he's telling us to listen to Mama Mia, take a chance on me. It's a
oh,
pretty
yeah.
engaging
Yeah.
song, right? But it's
Uh,
literally what it is. It's making sure you have your skill set, you have your capabilities, you
yeah,
are doing what you are doing, but you are making sure you are still making yourself visible, so the right entities might take a chance on you. So that's
right.
able to transition for you. So I sincerely do not know how to start. Means for the folks on the audience, we literally have here. I think even if me, David, and Tim and Kurt add all our degrees, you have way more degrees than all of us combined. And you are a true doctor, an engineer. You are
But
everything.
I'm embarrassed.
I'm not going to go with your bio, but
That's okay. That doesn't, yeah.
tell us a little bit about your journey. Means
Yeah.
I'm really still astounded. Means as you say, a 5-year kid from Chennai, India, and undeterred by your parents' kind of a heel to be a safe play, you started putting wet shoelaces into electrical points and got yourself shocked. Means you're
But
experimenting since that age. Means please tell us your attributes when you were young and maybe your journey over here.
Well, to be honest, I don't quite remember the details, but it's been repeated so many times to me by my aunts and my older cousins that I've got some kind of a, you know, a collage of those versions. But I think I'm just, again, as I heard David say, I'm just really lucky. I think I was in places where I got a little help at the right time with people who asked me to do things that they thought I could perhaps do. and I took, and so they took the risk in me. And frankly, just fast forwarding to how I got to Michigan, that was again, I think a risk my Ford took on the fact that they were hiring someone from the Silicon Valley who had nothing to do with cars, and frankly didn't have a direct tie to bent metal on wheels. But here I am. I
Here
thought
you
I'd
are.
be here for a few weeks to a few months actually, and I'd be back in California. But it's been 24 years and I'm here. So I think, yeah.
I think going to the David shared a chart, which was pretty interesting chart about all the way depression and anger, all the way till grateful. I think the second one below grateful was humbleness, and I think for the audience, it's nice to see your humbleness because you are. It's not just you are right now the what's next person in Ford. You are in charge of the mobility and the global innovation over there too, but you have been in NASA JPL lab. Means if you just look at the elements you have done in Silicon Valley, it's pretty amazing. Means uh, the inquisitiveness, the experimentation things, the what if scenarios. I think those are some of the elements that literally come to my mind every time I talk to you, listen to you, or just think about how I have to grow up and become like Prasad. That's what I keep on thinking.
Well, thank you. I think we also have a pretty good PR team that sits and listens to you and writes the bio. So sometimes I've got to look at it myself and say, "Oh, that's me." Yeah, but I think the spirit of it is nevertheless there. That I think um, the journey of exploration is important. As David mentioned, failure is a necessary prerequisite, but it has to be understood and executed well and appropriately. So I'm really delighted to be here, and just the way I think you have curated this group. And again, I'm basing it on a subsample, but I think it's a representative sample just based on the 90 or so seconds of David's discussions. And Tim, I'll have to make up for having missed your piece. But I think you really brought together this very, very vibrant set of discussions. And I think it's learnings for all of us here in various forms. So really
And
honored to be here.
we have taped the earlier ones also, so all the recordings are available
Thank
and
you.
will come to you. Lania would make sure they will send it to all the RSVP people as such. But I like the way you compare and contrast. Means you are no doubt in a technical world and in a mobility world, but in your spare time, you like adventures. You like hiking a lot, right? Means you try to seek out experiences from the nature and then try to
Yeah.
align with them, right? You're a biomimic, a bioinspiration, a biomimicry guy by nature, I would say.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's really, it's a great way to have a conversation, getting out into nature. As you know, from your photographic interests, you sort of get faced with questions and posed by challenges that you otherwise may not be able to quantify and bring to a limited size screen in front of you.
Yeah, and again means it's again as we go forward, people will try to understand your thought process. I hope the way you want to explain, and I'm really intrigued by the title of your topic, like complementing free innovation, the white space for design, the one Hippel principle. So before any further ado, if you want to share the screen and
Yeah,
guide
I'll
us
share the screen.
thoughts.
Of course, I've been playing with the title, so you might see a slightly different version, but that should be fine. So
Oh, yeah,
sharing screen,
earlier
let me go,
share the screen and
where do I go here? Share screen.
if you just hover on the screen, it should come below it. Right, Lanaya?
Below the screen. Oh, share screen. There it is. Yep, I see it. Yep. I do see it.
It'll ask.
Yeah, so I'll go there, share. Do you see it? I'll go to full presentation mode. Do you see that? And I go back to the new and improved title there. So yeah, so glad to, I don't have, the slides are fairly, but just I have a few slides, and they certainly aren't exciting or enticing in terms of the graphic nature or the illustrative nature. So you'll have to sort of consume the words, and then I can jump off to a browser and show some things and come right back if that would work, you think? Yeah, and so so let me sort of, so the point is, this is going to be more conversational in style. So if Linnea, if you see a question coming up in the conversation chats, let me know, or Jiva, feel free to interrupt me anytime. So I think there's sort of a really fascinating change happening. And I don't want to necessarily give it a label, although at some point a label might arise, like labels such as Industry 4.0, you hear this term, right? And so, and you don't have to know what it is, you don't have to, you can look it up if you want to, but fundamentally, with the cost of computing and the cost of communication having dropped, there's a significant change in which how value creation is beginning to happen. And although we're observing it today in various aggregated forms, the actual underlying phenomena, many of them have been around for quite a while, several decades, if not centuries. And so I'll spend a little bit on just what this new observation is, this new collective observation. And then, of course, you know, what does it mean to a producer? And here I'll sort of define what free means. Of course, I'll define what innovation means, but also, you know, what free in that context means. And then when I use the word producer here, it's the way economists tend to use it, and that's really a mass, high scale, high volume producer of a product or service. So it could be a manufacturer, it could be a service provider that makes products or services for a general market, as opposed to tailoring something for an individual in a small scale cottage industry production. So with that in mind, I obviously have to acknowledge a good part of this planet, and that's every household around the planet that is doing something, whether it's a really different way to cook something at home or fix your home and make it an exciting place for exercise and all kinds of connections in these times of COVID-19 or any number of other sort of contexts. And of course, there's lots of folks where I work at Ford, and our partners and our suppliers who, of course, innovate and co-create together. So, of course, thank you very much. And today, as I've sort of borrowed in the title, I'd like to especially point out Eric von Hippel. He and I, again, by sheer chance and serendipity, ran into each other through a matchmaker who was trying to do something and just basically wanted to give on both sides and go away. And then we became friends. And so we continue to challenge each other. So thank you, Eric. And after I wrote the title, I said, oops, maybe I should ask Eric. And he said, permission granted. So I've got that permission to use his name. And of course, he and I iterated on the definition because we wanted to be sure that at least he was in agreement with what I was saying. So I'll sort of spend some time on the von Hippel principle. And then, of course, go through some cases and then just speak a little bit about those design complements, which perhaps will interest many of us who start saying, okay, what on earth are we talking about here? And how do I take a message back home? I've spent this 45 minutes or a whole half day. And so how can we get something out of this? So I'll speak to that. So Eric has lots of, you can quickly Google his name, wiki his name, and you'll find plenty more than I can perhaps say in the course of the next few minutes. His latest and greatest book is Free Innovation. And as the name suggests, it is available free. All the electrons are available free. So you can go download the PDF version with essentially under the Creative Commons attribution. So you can copy it, modify it, embellish it, improve it with no requirements to give anything back other than the standard Creative Commons attribution request. You can, of course, also buy a hard copy of the book. And I'm not a advertiser here, but I happen to have one just because I find it more convenient when I get screen fatigue to go off and read something in the evenings. So I do have papyrus or hard copy versions of several things that just make me feel better when I interact with them. I think Eric Eric has a lot of clarifying definitions, and so let me paraphrase those. So first of all, free innovation happens when consumers produce goods or services for their own use, using their own capital and their unpaid labor. So maybe it's this precious commodity called the trampoline that you somehow want to modify. So both your 6-month-old baby and maybe your dogs and maybe an 85-year-old mother or grandma can sit on it. And that modification involves adjusting how you suspend it and how you adjust the tension and things of that nature. So you do that in your time, you use your own capital, maybe you buy some things to make that happen, and then you create that service for your family. So that's free innovation. In the sense that it's innovation because there's a functionally novel outcome of your effort. So it's not like following a recipe and making a dough, a bagel or a muffin, which is great too. And there's by the way, lots of improvisation involved in that. But here we talk about functional novelty. And so Eric and his collaborators spent about 10, 15 years surveying nations. So national surveys are specific procedures. There's a very, very carefully orchestrated methodology to national surveys. It's kind of like a census approach. And so you have to really follow not just the generally accepted processes of survey methodologies, but you also have to follow what is required by the national laws, by the regional sort of ordinances and laws. So it's very, very carefully done. And so they worked with survey experts to survey innovation across several different nations. It started off in the UK, went to a couple of other places, and now it's in several different countries. And so I'll sort of summarize that for you. But fundamentally, in all cases, what they found was in all the nations they surveyed, there's a significant amount of time, and there's a significant percentage of corporate R&D revenue, if you compare it, associated with this free innovation. So I'll get to what that means. And it's important to note that this sector within which we as consumers operate, all of us, we're all consumers, we consume things for our home needs and other private consumption purposes. are part of this thing called the household sector from an economic standpoint, as opposed to, say, a business sector or a government sector. And you can sort of look up there's plenty of work on that, and so you can get that sense of what we're talking about here. So here's quite in contrast to the beautiful slides I saw David show, and perhaps Tim did too. I didn't see that. Here's a boring table, but the headline, the message here is that you see 2.9 million people in the UK, 16 million in the US, so lots of people doing interesting things associated with household innovation. And so just what is this thing we're talking about in the von Hippel principle? So the principle really says that every innovation embodies a need and a responsive solution. So it's really a need solution pair. And a need solution pair must be found viable for at least one potential user. And the benefit, in other words, the benefits to that user must exceed the cost the user puts in if it has to be, if it can be applied, and if it needs to be applied, and if it needs to then stay applicable. And the cost, the word cost here is not used in terms of a traditional business cost or a government cost. It's the cost of your time going back to the trampoline. How many hours would I spend making these changes? It goes back to the parts you may go buy from a local hardware store or borrow from a friend. And so it's all that put together. So if that's going to be enormous and going to take months to do, you probably wouldn't bother doing it. But if it's something you can do over a weekend and then keep the family happy, or do it over an evening and keep the family happy for a season, you'd love to do that. So that's the kind of viability here. And it's important to understand that in this case, the market size typically is one. So you're saying it applies to at least one person. You're not doing this gigantic market segmentation to figure out what to do. You're just doing it because your family is going to be happy, and off you go do it. Now, producers have other objectives. They want to make things that are good for the general market or much larger scale. And so the question is, how do we build these complements? And so I'll sort of touch upon that. So I think given that backdrop, there were a couple of things that we were looking at as we sort of went through a number of discussions Eric and I had. And we discovered that this concept of free innovation is really a subset of this much broader consumer innovation. So the consumer innovation piece that is represented here in the surveys includes things like trying to use your own capital and your own time, but now to be able to feed it into a small business. Or it also includes things that, say, a farmer might do in his home or in his yard or in his barn to improve the working of a farm equipment, or maybe the big, farm sprinkler systems that he has or she has. But because that person is doing that with farming in mind, and he has a customer who's going to pay him money that's outside of himself, that we exclude all that. And so we say that there's still a significant piece of this consumer innovation associated with things that are inherently free, where it's just being done for the individual. So if you take a look at that subset, it still is a good amount. And now you get into saying, okay, well, what are those? And so this is a painfully busy chart, but let me sort of unravel the mystery here and speak through it in the form of a story, and then I'll sort of get back to some specifics. There's a number of cases that have been documented, and this sort of is in the broader context of lead users trying to do things. By lead users are people who are modifying the usage of their products or services before a firm or a larger group picks up those modifications and makes it a product or a service offering. So there's been cases of mountain biking, kite surfing, and more recently, I think as recently as just April 2020, which is last month, or 2 months ago now, there's been a sort of a business analysis of chronic disease treatment collectively, and what that means for firms and for producers. But of course, the evidence for that has been coming in many waves over the last few decades. So with that specific piece of chronic disease treatment in mind, let me share a couple of stories. And again, these have been pretty well documented. You can see the sources below. The Wall Street Journal reported this in 2014. Several others spoke about it. Most recently in April was this HBR article, and Eric has captured this in his book, one of the early chapters of his book. So if you look at what's on the right-hand side, the busy piece there, there was Jason Adams, who was an engineer sitting, working away when he was really concerned that his daughter Ella was a relatively young person, just couldn't go out for sleepovers. And that was because she was diabetic and he was concerned about her getting hypoglycemic. And so he was trying to figure out how he could, in some sense, be able to monitor her glucose levels. And there was no way to do that. He became aware of this group called, he was searching the web and he became aware of this group called Night Scout. Now the story to Night Scout has a very interesting origin, going back to this person called John Kostick, who is a software engineer working out in Livonia, New York, not Michigan, doing whatever he was doing for, I think it was Wegmans, a grocery chain. So he was modifying systems there. Jason Adams was again, and had his own day job. But John figured out how to go hack into a Dexcom CGM, continuous glucose monitor, and then figured out a way to, in some sense, publish it on the internet. About the same time, a guy called Lane Desborough, who was a controls engineer, he'd been working in oil refineries and big giant chemical engineering sort of control systems, had hacked his child's system, his continuous glucose system, and it created a remote display, essentially a display, a big, large home display with the alerts and warnings. So he could get a feel for his child's glucose level, but he hadn't worked out the internet connection. So it turned out that he and the folks and the work that John Kostick was doing came together because there was a whole group, a whole constellation of software engineers who had started working on similar kinds of things, seeing John Kostick's work, and it brought those together. And they, in fact, adopted the Night Scout name from what Lane Desborough was doing. And Lane then improved using his control systems background, improved the whole feedback loop to making that whole display much more predictable, much more reliable. Now, if you notice this whole thing, this whole sort of activity with people and what they were trying to do, it was all being done on their own time, on their own dime. And because they had a certain need, and in this case, the need was to remotely display the level of glucose. And they came up with a behavioral response, sort of a responsive solution that involved being able to use the internet to then display it on any kind of terminal device. It turned out they started off first on Android devices. Then, of course, there was a very creative smartwatch. Some of you might remember, it was called Pebble. And so they used Pebble as a display system, using one of those if then do this kind of response coding languages, scripting languages, and off it went to the Pebble smartwatch. And then, of course, came on to other devices, other operating systems. So this is an example, going back to the von Hippel principle, where you see a specific need, the need to remote display something. In this case, something where each of these users have a very deep and a well-defined need, and they go off and create a solution individually initially, and then they just publish it. And then anyone else who wants to take that, adapt that, or adopt it as is, can go off and do what they have to do. And then you find a responsive solution leading to another responsive solution. And soon you find a whole array of solutions from which you can get a number of iterations, a number of refinements, and then make it available either as a community service, as a common good, or of course, nothing prevents a firm from going ahead and in some sense, creating a whole product out of that, which is also happening. And I'll sort of get to, some of how that happens. So this was just one piece of a much broader puzzle in terms of chronic disease treatment. This is diabetes here. There's the other side of the same ailment. This is diabetes here, where you fundamentally have to calculate just how much of insulin, if in fact this treatment, the ailment requires insulin delivery, how much insulin needs to be pumped back into the body. It turns out the manufacturers are very good at making insulin pumps. It's a very precise kind of a system. There's lots of people who can design systems to very, very tight specifications. The same is true of continuous glucose monitors. If you Google either of these, you'll find plenty of options. There's some pretty well-known names. Dexcom is one, Medtronic is another, and there's several others. But what's missing from the standpoint of the user, the patient, the caregiver, is just how much of insulin do I have to now get myself, given what I need, given what I know of myself, and how do I now make sure that it's delivered at the right with the right schedule? That piece was missing. So it turned out, and in the human body, that's what the pancreas does. So Dana Lewis, whose name I show right on the lower left-hand side, was in search of the answer to this question. And it turned out that her boyfriend at that time, a significant other and husband now, could write code, and he was really in a deep sense of trying to solve this problem, but also understanding just what he could do himself. And so he took all the data, raw requirements from Dana, and created an algorithm, and essentially created this artificial pancreas. When Dana and lots of others were told, well, you just got to wait for some more time. It's coming maybe in 5 years or 10 years. And they said, we just can't wait. So she went off working with a small group of people, but she essentially quantified the algorithm, wrote the algorithm, people wrote code, and then off that went. So they were able to now create this thing called do-it-yourself, pancreas system, and got a larger community to work. And so you can look up Dana's story. It's a fascinating one. But fundamentally, here was the second case where Dana had a need, and she went out and created this the solution, which is basically an insulin an algorithm for to quantify the amount of insulin needed. And so in both cases, what you see, whether it's in the Night Scout case to create a display, or in Dana's case to create a dosage calculator, they were able to, as a market size of one, create a pairing between a specific need they had and a solution that they were able to design and create for themselves. And so the story here really is that that you have plenty of these that can be discovered, that need to be discovered. And so the question really is, how does one discover these? How does one build a bridge to them? And how does one then create a complementary value proposition? So it turns out, and I might come back to this if you want to play a little video clip here, but let me just get to one more point, and then I can come back to the earlier discussion. So it turns out that producers and these free innovators complement each other in many, many different ways. Producers are interested, as I said earlier on, in terms of creating products and solutions for a general market, for a general market need. And so they want to go build things in scale. Of course, the free innovators want to build it for a market size of one. And so sometimes there can be a great stimulus in terms of reducing what an individual sort of free innovator might be wanting to do by offering innovation support. So of course the some of the widely cited examples are around what Lego did with building blocks and how that led to all kinds of Mindstorm related businesses. But even in the context of sort of high tech work, there's been a lot of work around how NVIDIA, the GPU chip manufacturer, offered all kinds of building blocks that created gaming challenges that then challenged the existing design of NVIDIA's product assumptions and helped give back a whole lot of innovation designs. So there's been plenty of work, in all kinds of contexts that have stimulated this kind of a loop between innovation support and innovation designs. So if you sort of go back, if you just look at what I show here, you might ask what it is that the free innovators get out of doing this. And going back to the trampoline example, what they get is the self-reward. So they're happy that their family is happy. They feel happy that they have got this project completed. And typically, that's more or less what it is. In the broader context of the consumer innovators, you might find some people who are rewarded by having tried something out using their own capital, own time, and sort of own resources to go off and experiment with something before they go insert it into their small business or sell it for value. But in terms of free innovation, most people are just very happy with the self-reward that they get. And they're happy to share it with their peers. So you see any number of these open source publications and open source repositories, including those you find on GitHub. A lot of these, and I sort of mentioned this earlier on, started off as small, relatively small, self-organized projects, and that's how these tend to generally take root. Of late, over the last 5 or 10 years, one has seen a tremendous growth in terms of how they get aggregated, and those are the tables, the country surveys that that Eric and co have done. And so there's a lot of evidence now that in a number of economies, the percentage of equivalent money being spent and the percentage of rewards that could translate into actual local currencies and commerce value are pretty significant compared to what R&D spending happens. So it's something like 5 or 6 in certain countries. So it could be, I can look back I can get back with the specific numbers, or you can find this in Eric's book. But the numbers really are pretty astounding. In some cases, it exceeds R&D budgets. I think it's in the UK, where the consumer R&D spending, consumer spending on this kind of self-rewarded work exceeds the spending by corporate R&D. It doesn't exceed that in the US. That's because the R&D spending in the US, the sort of producer R&D spending is pretty high. But even you think in a place like the UK, consumer spending would be much smaller than that of producer spending, and that's not the case. So there's a number of different potential value propositions here. I could go back. How are we doing in terms of time, Chibak? Can I go back to a little clip? Or
I think we should save a little bit time for Q&A also.
Yeah, so let's take Q&A. Let's go to Q&A now.
You have a last closing slide or a last closing statement? Yeah, please.
No, I think the closing statement is right back here. I can just go back to right here, and I say that it's design complements to the producer, and I think there's a number of different ways. I mentioned a couple of tools, but I think that's about it. I think the most important slide, if I have to, land on one slide, it will be this.
This is really, Prasadji, this is really beautiful. I mean, it's,
yep.
The way you explain it, like it's not just free innovation, but a part of the consumer innovation. I like the word, the lead user solutions, and market segment of just one. Means right now that person, he or her, are not considered about anything else in the world, selling, marketing, and all the other burdens that you have to consider. But I want to solve this for me or my kid or my pet, and here is a solution. And then it diffuses. That's pretty interesting. Means, is this would the genesis of Patagonia or the Yeti cooler, would those also fall under this category? Because they also started with the Shoonyard brothers. I don't know how to pronounce that name.
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
The founders, they wanted to, they were, in a way, as per their own story, they were lost, and they found climbing as their thing, as a calling. But they saw that the pittons, the metal spikes they use were not strong enough, and they devised for themselves. And people say, I want to buy for $1.50 or $2 there, and then it started diffusion from there. Would that also fall into this mountain biking, kite surfacing kind of a thing?
I think it would. Yeah, it would fall into that piece. It may not necessarily fall into the sort of free piece, but really, if you look at this, back to the principle here, every innovation embodies a need and a responsive solution. So that's exactly what they had. They had a responsive solution to their need,
Yes.
and they found this need solution pair, and of course they found it to be viable, and then they decided how to scale it. So because they had a business interest, it was sort of different from the free innovation. They might have not wanted to give it away, so to speak. But nevertheless, it's very tightly coupled. And the same principles apply from if you ask yourself as a boutique design firm, or if you ask yourself as a producer, the tools you would use to capture this would be more or less the same. You might have an IP agreement in the case of, say, the Patagonia case, because, they wanted to make money, and that's perfectly okay. And in fact, we want that, right?
Yeah.
The other piece I want to touch on here in this very busy chart is not so much, if you take the technology aside, take the innovation objectives and those kinds of targets out of this whole discussion, it goes back to the point that David was making, and that is the abundance of soft skills here. None of this happens if you don't want to reach out to somebody else. So in Jason's case, in John's case, in Lane's case, and in Dana's case,
Yeah.
they had a really, really strong and urgent need, but they also knew how to work with others and knew to work with others in remarkable ways. And sometimes it seems counterintuitive. A constellation of software engineers came together, and when you think of highly social beings, you don't think of software engineers. And I can say that because I happen to spend some time being a software engineer. So, but yet it was so critical and important. And back to David again, the iterative testing and the failures that come through all that, and that's sort of stated here too. So it's the peer-to-peer piece that allows for this replication improvement, and just allowing the, in some sense, to put hubris aside and say, here's a sample that works for me, and somebody else saying, that's great, but it really fails for me. And, how about trying this? Maybe it'll work for both of us. And then, the other person saying, yep, it works for me. And now can you tell me if it works for you? And then both people finding it works for both. And now it becomes a market size of 2. But each person thinks it's just for them, and that's fine. So I think going back to how this might actually support a firm, Dexcom, by the way, the same Dexcom that's here, shown twice. It's shown twice because in the first stage it didn't have a remote display, then it got a remote display. It's shown here because something very interesting is happening. And this is going back in 2014, 2015. Dexcom in 2024, I think, is going to come out with a CGM that has associated with it a dosage calculator that's going to be tied to a pump. So they're going to be offering interfaces to all this, including the dosage calculator. And oh, by the way, they hired 2 people from the Night Scout community to become insiders at Dexcom. So again, here's a case where a producer is now benefiting directly from this kind of free innovation, right? So
it's pretty interesting. I mean, some of the things that really surprised me was when you mentioned about, at least in the UK, the consumer R&D was over the corporate R&D, and that's pretty amazing.
Yeah,
and
I can look up the number. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and again, it might go a little bit here and there.
Hmm?
When it comes back to the US kind of a perspective,
Yeah.
it might not be there because we are heavily investing into R&D, the entire industry. But what comes to mind is, and maybe Eric von Hippel, he might have some light to shed on this, is I would see Siemens, not exactly, but the startup, the inventors, the innovators who start up with their ideas, they would all start with elements like this, right? Means lead user, free innovation elements. But surprisingly, in the US market, around 85 to 80%, the earlier of the startups fail in the first 3 years, and I don't know how to whether they solve it for them, and then it wants to go and leverage to be in the world of, I would say, the business or designing it again for a little bit expanded demographics. There might be happening something over there. So I do not know whether that's a question or just an observation. But it's interesting to see. I would say some of the questions would be like, how would means how would a corporation find these lead users and means actively, means you can have your own industrial design department or design department, you can go to an independent studio, but this is a pretty interesting way, not literally crowdsourcing, because you are still trying to find them and align them onto something. You're literally reaching out to this one man team. Are any big corporations doing that successfully?
Well, I think so. The Dexcom one is an interesting example. I
Okay.
think you found. I think 3M is got some pretty good examples. So this is quite different from crowdsourcing. In the crowdsourcing case, you sort of said, "I have a problem, and I'm going to go search for it. And if you have a solution, come back to us." So it
Correct.
turns out most of these self-rewarded people are not going to raise their hand and go for some $10,000, $5,000, even a $20,000,
Yeah.
challenge, because they're happy to find their solution. They've got their satisfaction, and they go on. So what you do need is the use of tools. So these days, there's a company called Ipsos, IPSOS. Have you heard of them? They're a market research company. They're one of the large ones. So I can send you the details on that. But Ipsos has recently done a pretty nice survey, and this is public and it's published. I can send a link to. So they used the kite surfing example, and they said, okay, well, let's search the word kite surfing in all kinds of communities and come up with some contextual information. And they found, a really fascinating breakdown of where they can tie producer needs to existing solutions. So that's one example. So that then I think you're getting to a point where you can find a lot of tools coming into place. By the way, I got the numbers. The UK spending is about 2.6 or so billion, and it exceeded, here it is. So in the UK, consumers spend about 5.2 billion translated to US dollars. So US dollars worth of funds overall each year.
Wow.
Whereas firms who specialize in consumer products, so that's the comparison, right? So not all R&D, spend 3.6 billion. So 3.6 billion spent by R&D, by firms on consumer product R&D, whereas 5.2 billion spent by consumers. And of course, this could also say that the consumers aren't efficient, and it's absolutely true. They're not focused on efficiency. So the 5.2 billion, although much higher than 3.6, is perhaps a very inefficient spend. And so that's the number for the UK. For the US, it's 20.2 billion based on consumer spends, and 62 billion on R&D, say by the likes of Procter & Gamble and many others, but R&D spending on consumer products. Now, 20.2 billion in the US, 5.2 billion in the UK, these are very large numbers.
Big,
In Japan, it's 5.8 billion consumer spending on their own sort of free and self-motivated innovation, and 43 billion or so roughly by firms on consumer product R&D. So the scale is pretty massive.
It's pretty massive. It's pretty interesting. So, should companies, means as a part of nowadays, it's not just I would say finding solutions to your products, or I would say your solutions or your services as such. People are trying to invent their business models also. So, should companies then try to encourage their consumers who are already buying their products and brand to further have them do some free innovation on their platform? Can they think about weaving that as part of their ongoing loops?
I think you're finding some of the companies doing that. In the software world, they've been doing it for a while. So that's how this whole business of offering, Android with a whole lot of APIs came into play. In the hardware world with 3D printing, you're beginning to see some of that take place. But consumers think very, very differently. They're not going to be necessarily attracted to something that a manufacturer presents themselves, because for them, a solution is something that takes into account lots of different dimensions in their one specific need. And so the real value comes in being able to somehow sense that,
Yeah.
and then see what you can do as a producer to be able to scale it if in fact there's a general market for you.
Yes, I would say this is pretty interesting. Just as I think in baseball or some of the sports like that, they have scouts who
Yeah,
literally go to the ends of the world, and with their only one thing is trying to find talent. They are just literally going everywhere. It's finding a needle in a haystack, right? It's trying to find the intelligent life out there in the universe. So, if some companies who understand the power of this and
yeah.
try to see whether they can either buy it or append it or license it from them. Because you're right, some of the inventors will try to do this with the express motive of an exit strategy where they want to sell it to somebody. But
That's
this is
okay, and there's plenty of room for that too, of
different. This
course.
is like, I don't know anything, I want to solve it for right now, and they're happy with it. You're right. The reward is
Absolutely.
their own self fulfillment and self satisfaction for them and their family. But then the scout arrives in the way of any other
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
That's a pretty interesting way. I'm so glad. Means the methods of innovations are many. Means there can be evolutionary innovation, like I think you mentioned, like a farmer to his son and the son to his grandson, and it slowly grows. There can be boundary level innovation. There can be happenstance innovation. There can be structural innovation like
Oh,
industrial.
absolutely.
But this is just going to be there. People are doing that. You're right. Means household innovation is happening, and sometimes people don't know they might be sitting on the amazing idea, not just to make money, but if they solve the problem for somebody else somewhere in the world might benefit from that being better and beautiful. That's pretty interesting. I know we are a little bit over time, but I think we should still take. We are taking questions, but anything from this perspective? Do you think this is going to stay, or this was from the past? Means it's there, we have seen this happening, but the longevity of it in this newer world or the new normal world, would this be more now? Wouldn't this be more ingrained in what we are doing as individuals?
Yeah, no, I think you're going to see a lot more of this. I mean, just what we're seeing in this pandemic phase, where people are creating all kinds of things. I think you're going to find that as we get to the next normal, there's going to be a lot more of sort of household sector improvisation. People may not necessarily want to get out someplace just to go buy something, but they might if they want to go buy that to go build something, you know. And so you're going to find, I don't know how to sort of use a crystal. I don't have a crystal ball here, but I'm just saying that the enablers to making things has really become much more democratized. Whether it's being able to find a solution that you need as part of a bigger problem you have, or whether it's being able to communicate what you have to get an improved version back.
So you mentioned about, like, yes, the electronics or the software industry is always already leveraging those kind of an elements too. But coming back to the world of tactile products as such,
Yeah.
would you think just by the virtue of this methodology, any specific product category would have more to gain from this versus some other categories?
Well, I think what we're seeing is this do-it-yourself pancreas and night scout. So it's really where there's personal health, where there's personal sort of, you know, enlightenment or education. You know, people are saying, "Well, like, this is crazy. I'm not able to. My kid seems to be otherwise pretty good, but is just not able to get this calculus piece right." And so off you go, and you have Khan Academy or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so and then when it comes to some basics like water, clean water in particular, but just even water, you know, as the world gets more and more dry, you're beginning to find all kinds of innovation around how to do drip irrigation. And these drip irrigation pieces aren't coming from the big Israel, you know, or sort of alternative energy ventures and nation states that are trying to do this, but they're coming from relatively small communities who are basically doing it so their half an acre land can get just enough water at the level of a plant or at the level of a you know, piece of soil. So there's fascinating work going on in that space. So broadly speaking, health, education, water, and then I think and energy.
Hmm.
You know, these are pretty big, powerful areas, a lot of which are regulated in various ways. So it wasn't just kite flying, and that's fun too, by the way. Kite surfing is great, mountain biking is great. But if you look at these four domains, you'll see plenty happening.
You're right. It's actually coming back to the world of growing or conservation of water instead of desertification
Yeah,
or I would say erosion as such. That's a pretty significant thing. What people were doing just for themselves, for their
yeah.
field, eventually went to some villages of about I know how to say that in Hindi, but I do not know how to
Mhm.
translate that in English. About you just have to. Sometimes water is not the problem. The
Right,
water,
right, right.
or storage of water is the problem.
Yeah.
Like you get amazing inches of water
Yep.
throughout the year, but you just get them in 2 or 3 days.
Right. So harvesting
That's
and preserving and
making sure
storing.
the
Yeah.
water infiltrates and builds up the water table rather than having just go over there.
Absolutely.
Like there
Absolutely.
have been individual kind of an projects like this. So do you think most of the projects like this stem from altruism rather than profiteering?
No, it's not even, it's not even the big altruism piece, it's just simply self-reward. So, what would you call you, sort of having a water harvesting or essentially a water capturing system in your home? That's, more just a family thing. You want to serve your family and you want to reduce your water bill maybe, but it's more, a direct need. So altruism takes it to a higher level. But this really says the self-reward. So I have this trampoline, I want to make sure everyone can use it. I'm going to do it, right? And so, or I have water and I see water flowing out and it's crazy. I'm going to create this little, garden that looks beautiful in the seasons when plants grow. But otherwise, I can capture water and use it, and then I can figure out how to keep it clean and all that.
That's pretty interesting. I know we are going a little bit beyond, so thank you for your extra time.
Thank you. Yeah,
But
I'm not in a rush.
at least means apart from this is great because I know hopefully we would get we can elaborate more on this like mountain biking. I'm
Mhm.
now dying to read about it, about how did it start and how did it happen, or maybe we can share some links through chat or eventually afterwards also if there are any specific things. But already I think you mentioned the book is there from Eric. I think at least the last question, if not the second last question is, this is great topic. This is good. I love that. But coming back to the world of innovation or the world of being a designer or a design-led leading person as such, as like you are. So there are, in our audience, we have plenty of people who might be in their earlier part of careers as such.
Mhm.
So you have an illustrious career and you're still doing some amazing things. On the hindsight, do you want to share what helped you in building your journey? What were those attributes, or what should be the attributes that people should try to inculcate in them to eventually become somewhere like you or Tim or David or Kurt? What would be some
Yeah.
of
So
the pieces of wisdom or advice to them, parting thoughts to them?
yeah, I think just from my own uh, journey's perspective, I heard David say this. So it's sort of very similar. There's a lot of good fortune, good luck, and really gratitude for all the joys that serendipity brought. So I could share, a few specific cases, noting that this is just a data point, a single data point. When I was wrapping up my PhD dissertation, I got a question from an audience, and that person asked me a question for which I had no answer, no clue, and I was really, in some sense, at a uh, I was trying to figure out what might have motivated the question. It turned out that that person was a psychologist. I was an engineer, and so we hadn't really crossed paths, even the nature of the work we did, and I landed up working with him as a postdoc. I then learned from him that he had grown up as an engineer too. And had spent, so this goes back, clearly I'm dating myself here, but during World War II, he had spent time as a helping radar engineers break camouflage. And
Wow.
so the way you broke camouflage when you were on a plane was you took two photographs, one now and then one just a few seconds later, and then you triangulated them to see if you could break camouflage. That led to all kinds of sort of questions in his mind. And he went out to create, I don't know if you remember this, but maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, there was all these random dot patterns where you could find them in malls and you could find a
3D
3D
part of it, yeah.
popping up, right? So,
Kilograms.
right. So random dot seriograms, the conceptual process of that and how one could use that as a psychoanatomical tool so in other words, trying to understand your brain but without using pincers or scissors, but using psychology, was created by this person called Bela Ulez. So again, he had a job, and so I ran into him. It was chance. But the point is that um, you have to just be open. I think it really helps. It helps being open to sort of questions that come from completely different spaces, and you don't have to have the answer. And you can happily say, I don't know the answer. And it might turn out that the person asking the question really also doesn't, I mean, asking the question in part because they don't know the answer, but in part because they think they can work with you to find a solution, as it happened in David's case, in the case of Bela Ulez, who asked me this question. So that then led me to a completely different journey. Otherwise, I was going to find a job with a local tech company, and I would have been, off working there. But I ended up working with Bela as I became essentially apprentice with a psychologist for a year and a half. Went into psychophysics, and then I ended up going to Caltech because of that, because the International Space Station was coming together, and they needed ways to inspect the surface of the space station for tiles that they put on it without being able to have unacceptable failures. So you had to make sure that a tile was truly defective before you replaced it, because otherwise you'd be sending too many spare tiles, and you didn't want the converse to happen because it'd be a mission failure. And so they were using what we'd call today computer vision, but that was just evolving in those days, and it turned out my training was in computer vision, and Bela's the postdoc work had really helped me not just break camouflage, but be able to encode those signals back to Earth at a much higher rate. And so that there was a very practical use. In this case, the single market was JPL, that was a contractor to NASA. But I couldn't have connected these two, right? I mean, if this random question hadn't come up in a defense where, there's 25 people there, and one old man in the last row raises his hand and says, hey, can you do this? And I say, I can't. But that then led to a very, to being part of a solution to a market of one, which was basically NASA, right? And so it was very, very, very interesting. That then led me to another, project, and on and on. So I think the point is, luck really plays a role. And as someone said, in some sense, you have to be prepared to receive that luck. And the second thing is, I think really, David made this point, you have to really, you have all the skills, you may have the hard skills that you get trained around. The more difficult ones are really the soft skills, because they don't transfer easily. And so, in other words, I can't explain to you exactly what soft skill is needed to be able to replicate the Night Scout effort. In fact, I don't know what it was. And it might be very hard for the folks involved in Night Scout to be able to translate that as a requirement for another person to replicate the Night Scout model. It's really hard. So that kind of sticky information is very, very hard to transfer. So I think, but having the sort of large view as well as a narrow view, using and really being open to these compliments helped me, I think.
I like that, because you're right. Means it's the way you mentioned, not just the open mind, but also be prepared to embrace that, like what we know, what we don't know, what we don't know, really don't know. And that's pretty impressive. Means I forgot you were also on that surface evaluation observation technology for International Space Station, and that literally is a market of one, and there's only one single International Space Station. So no matter what, you still need to develop and design for those things. That's
yeah. Yeah, I think I just add quickly. I think one of the most powerful technologies human beings invented was language. Just this ability to translate our thoughts into words, and words into a specific spoken language or an alphabet. I think the language of collaboration is still evolving. We've got Zoom now as a tool, but I remember spending almost 3 to 4 months when I first started at Ford, getting frustrated that my collaborators on the other end of campus weren't responding to me. It turned out that they were equally frustrated. They were sending me very beautiful design diagrams, and they were wanting to show me their clay models. And I just didn't know what I would do with clay models and what I would do with design. I was sending them software code and Excel spreadsheets, and they were afraid to click on those things because it didn't mean anything to them. So it took us those 3 months or 4 months of frustration to realize that we really needed a common language. And that common language wasn't something magical, wasn't a new language. It was just basically co-locating and breaking down the barriers of mistrust that we had between ourselves. And that led to some amazing work and amazing speed of iterations and amazing joy in just showcasing the various things that failed. Up until then, we were so stressed about showing the one thing that worked and not having anything to do with the thing that failed. But we created a wall of failures just because each of those failures had a funky story to themselves, right?
You're right there, Prasad. Means the co-location thing is so important, and you can see things like means everybody has their strengths, everybody had their weaknesses. I think
yeah,
you're right. Means as design community, I would say I should speak that for the whole community. Designers are literally morbidly afraid of mathematics or this deep kind of an Excel sheets as such, but they're rich with data. They're rich with evidence with which we just need to break them apart so that you understand what to glean from them. And the reverse also, right? Means sometimes mathematicians or physicists might be afraid of like, I cannot do that, but no, you're not expected to sketch the next Ford Bronco or something. There are people who can do that, but you have to let them know what parameters and what things are working there. So that's beautiful. I know this all good things have come to an end. So somehow we'll have to stop this discussion. But we will personally we will pick it up sometime on the coffee chat or pretty soon. But we'd like to learn and listen more from you. So thank you once again, Prasad.
Thank you very much, folks. Thanks everyone, and all of you for hosting us. And yourself, Jivak, and of course David.
Push all the links to Eric's book and other elements that you mentioned via our follow-up kind of an.
I'll send you this presentation. You can do whatever you want to do.
Okay, no problem. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just for you can mute yourself or unmute yourself. Also, I'm just going to wrap this in.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you, everybody, again. I think this was a beautiful afternoon. Means I literally enjoy these afternoons. This gives me an element to keep on looking forward for every month to have this kind of an at least a one-way intellectual flow from the speakers to me, and just like that to you also. But having different perspectives from FCA, from Tim, from Ford, from Prasad, from Sundberg-Ferar, from Kurt, and from Stryker, from David. It's just amazing to see how different minds work. All of them have some rich experiences from different facets of life, different stage levels, and how to pick from some of them. Right? Means right now we have in front of us in this last 4 hours or so, and an ocean of, if not ocean, let's say a sea of information, and it all depends on what you bring to the sea. You get a spoon, you'll get a spoonful. You get a wheelbarrow, you will get a wheelbarrow full. So. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Let us know via this or via email to me or Lanaya what other topics you might want to listen to. We are curating this from our audience. If you want to suggest any speaker or any company, we are fortunate to be aligned with many thought leaders around the nation. We will try to, as long as their schedules are working, have them and come and speak. But feel free to let us know the topics, any speaker, personal names, or any brand names. And we will try to make sure we will try to curate that for you. And this is where we just try to exchange thoughts, perspectives, and insights, and hopefully it all makes us richer. I know it makes me too. So without further ado, thank you for staying on as such, and see you for our next element, maybe at the Tonight Show, which is more fun, more inspirational, more motivational, with little bit sprinklings of industrial design, but hopefully you can see that kind of an element also. Thank you and have a great day ahead.